There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from holding life too tightly. It settles in quietly, disguised as responsibility, maturity, even intelligence. You tell yourself you're just being realistic, that you've learned how the world works, that taking things seriously is the price of being an adult. But somewhere along the way, something subtle happens. Your body stops relaxing when nothing is wrong. Your mind stops resting even in moments that should feel light. Every interaction begins to feel like it carries weight, consequence, implication. And the most unsettling part is that none of this feels dramatic. It feels normal. You wake up already braced, already alert, already slightly tense, as if life itself is something that needs to be managed before it gets out of hand. What if this constant seriousness isn't protecting you at all? What if it's slowly draining something essential, not through crisis, but through quiet compression? Most people who live this way don't think of themselves as anxious or unhappy. They think of themselves as careful, thoughtful, prepared. They believe seriousness is what keeps things from falling apart. But look closely, and you'll notice how little room there is left for spontaneity, for ease, for moments that aren't immediately evaluated for meaning or outcome. Even joy begins to feel suspicious, like something that needs justification. Laughter comes with a brief aftertaste of guilt. Rest feels earned only after exhaustion. You're always one step ahead of life, rehearsing responses, anticipating consequences, scanning for what could go wrong. And because this posture is rewarded, praised as discipline, self-control, depth, it rarely gets questioned. But beneath that praise, something is tightening. You're no longer responding to life as it happens. You're responding to a version of it that exists mostly in your head. The fear here isn't that you'll fail or lose or fall behind. The deeper fear is that you're living in a constant state of prevention, guarding against outcomes that haven't arrived, and in doing so, missing the texture of what's actually happening. Seriousness becomes a kind of armor, but armor is heavy. It restricts movement. It dulls sensation. Over time, you stop noticing how much effort it takes just to remain composed, just to stay in control, just to keep everything meaningful and contained. And the most dangerous part is that this doesn't feel like a problem to solve. It feels like who you are now, like growth, like wisdom earned through experience. But what if this seriousness isn't insight at all? What if it's a response that once made sense, but never stood down? What if the weight you carry isn't proof that life is hard, but evidence that you've been living as if it always needs to be handled with caution? If that's true, then the cost isn't dramatic or immediate. It's slow, it's cumulative, and it raises an uncomfortable question that most people avoid. What exactly are you protecting yourself from? And when did you decide that life itself required this much vigilance? What most people never notice is that seriousness doesn't stay contained inside the mind. It reorganizes the way you move through the world. At first, it feels like a preference, being thoughtful, measured, intentional. But over time, it becomes a structure that quietly governs your behavior. You stop entering situations openly and start entering them with preloaded interpretations. Conversations are no longer exchanges. They are calculations. You listen less to what is being said and more to what might be implied. Even neutral moments carry a background tension, as if something unseen needs to be anticipated before it arrives. This is how seriousness stops being a mood and becomes an environment. You don't decide to be vigilant anymore. Vigilance is simply there, shaping what feels safe to express, what feels risky to say, what feels acceptable to feel. And because this posture often prevents obvious mistakes, it gets reinforced. You avoid embarrassment. You avoid conflict. You avoid uncertainty. Relief follows, quietly confirming that staying controlled was the right move. But that relief comes at a cost that's harder to name. Life begins to feel narrow, not because anything is wrong, but because everything is filtered. You hesitate before speaking. You rehearse before acting. You hold back reactions until they've been inspected for appropriateness. Over time, spontaneity starts to feel irresponsible. Play feels childish. Lightness feels exposed. And none of this feels imposed from the outside. That's what makes it dangerous. You believe you're choosing it, but notice how automatic it has become. How quickly seriousness appears before curiosity has a chance to surface. How often you feel the weight of consequence before the moment has even unfolded. This isn't discipline. It's conditioning. A nervous system trained to treat uncertainty as a threat, meaning as something that must be managed, and experience as something that requires constant interpretation. The world rewards this. Serious people are seen as reliable, composed, mature, so the posture deepens. You become someone who is always handling things, even when nothing needs to be handled. And slowly, almost invisibly, your inner life contracts. Not because joy disappears, but because it has fewer places to land. You don't feel miserable, you feel managed, controlled, functional. And that functionality becomes the proof that the system works. But beneath it, something is being traded away. Not happiness in a dramatic sense, but immediacy, aliveness, the ability to meet moments as they are, instead of as problems waiting to be solved. And the most unsettling part is this. The longer you live inside this structure, the harder it becomes to imagine another way of being. Seriousness stops feeling like a response to life and starts feeling like life itself, which raises a deeper question that most people never ask. If this posture was learned, reinforced, and rewarded, what happens when it no longer serves you, but you no longer know how to stand without it? What makes this structure so convincing is not that it is rigid, but that it appears intelligent. Seriousness doesn't demand obedience, it offers protection. It doesn't force compliance, it anticipates risk before risk has time to appear. And that anticipation is where its weakness hides. Because anticipation is built entirely on projection. It operates ahead of experience, assembling responses to events that have not yet occurred. The moment itself becomes secondary. Life is approached as something that must be pre-managed, pre-interpreted, pre-contained. This is why seriousness feels strongest before action, not after. The weight is heaviest in the pause, in the mental rehearsal, in the silent narrowing of options that happens before anything real has had the chance to contradict the prediction. Once something actually happens, it is rarely as catastrophic as expected. But the system doesn't wait for contact. It organizes itself in advance, compressing experience into something small enough to control. That compression works efficiently, reliably, and precisely because it works, it doesn't correct itself. There is no feedback mechanism inside anticipation. Nothing inside seriousness asks whether the danger it prepared for was ever real. One successful avoidance reinforces the posture. One managed interaction confirms the strategy. Over time, the system stops responding to life and starts responding to itself. It becomes a loop that feeds on consistency. This is why a single spontaneous moment rarely changes anything. One laugh, one risk, one unguarded reaction can be dismissed as an exception, but repetition is threatening, not because it proves something positive, but because it introduces evidence that anticipation cannot fully account for. Patterns expose prediction as unnecessary, and the system senses this. So it adapts, not by relaxing but by becoming more vigilant. Awareness enters the structure not as freedom but as oversight. You begin watching yourself closely, monitoring tone, managing reactions, regulating expression. Seriousness refines itself. What once felt automatic now feels deliberate, and that deliberateness is mistaken for progress. But control has simply replaced reflex. Management has replaced contact. And with each layer of supervision, the system becomes heavier. Not safer, heavier. Discipline arrives too late in the sequence to interrupt this. Insight arrives after anticipation has already done its work. Even understanding what's happening does not dissolve the posture. It often intensifies it. Because now there is something else to manage, yourself. The weakness is real, but it is not accessible through effort, insight, or intention. It exists at the level of timing, not will. And the more seriously you try to correct it, the more tightly the structure closes around that attempt, which leads to an uncomfortable realization most people never reach. If seriousness adapts this easily, what happens when even awareness becomes part of the mechanism rather than an exit from it? What follows once this is seen is not clarity, it is not relief, it is a subtle collapse of urgency. The system does not shatter. It doesn't need to. It simply stops arriving first. The reflex to prepare, to brace, to manage begins to lose its timing advantage. Not because you intervene, and not because you decide otherwise, but because the cost of anticipation quietly outweighs its usefulness. Seriousness still appears, but it no longer organizes everything around it. The body registers how much energy it takes to stay compressed, how much effort is spent maintaining a posture that rarely meets anything real. Control starts to feel inefficient, not wrong, inefficient, and that inefficiency changes the balance. What once felt necessary now feels heavy. What once felt protective now feels delayed. You notice that life happens anyway. Conversations unfold whether you regulate them or not. Moments pass whether you rehearse them or not. The outcomes are not dramatically different, but the strain is. Something loosens, not as an act of courage, not as a decision, but as a consequence. Seriousness relied on being early, on arriving before experience, on shaping response in advance. When that timing advantage erodes, its authority does too. This is why the ending feels flat. There is no surge of freedom, no reclaimed identity, no triumphant release. There is simply less interference, less preemption, less compression. Things occur closer to when they actually occur, not ahead of time in the mind. Machiavelli understood this kind of power, not as domination but as sequence. Influence dissolves when reactions stop preceding events, and so does self-surveillance. Not all at once, not permanently, but enough. Enough that life no longer requires constant guarding. Enough that seriousness is no longer the price of participation. Nothing has been solved, nothing has been fixed, but something has stopped pressing. And in that absence, experience regains its original timing. Whatever happens, happens in real time, not before.